As I reflected on what area of Fredericksburg I wished to represent in this artifact, I found that the questions posed in the community as text prompt were hard to tease apart. Here, history is under our feet, built into our walls, but not always well memorialized. Here, my adopted home, is where I'm weathering the pandemic and trying as I can to support local businesses that are also ailing. I decided that I would stand on a small plot of ground where many of these forces intersect and see what I noticed there. Here are my feet at the bottom. I cast my shadow on a very hot morning, and I started thinking about shadows, how they represent real things or people in real conditions, but are ephemeral, unpredictable. That's how the whole world feels to me right now. Here's my spot. The historical marker did my work by outlining the area once known as Liberty Town. I've never looked at these markers before, though I've walked by them literally hundreds of times. I'm both a local and a tourist. Just on the edges of this intersection of Liberty and Barton Streets, notice the outline of Hercamp Park at the bottom and of the space marked Potter's Field at the top. These are still meaningful and somewhat complicated open spaces I'll talk about later. The historical marker lists just 2 people as critical to the development of Liberty Town. Like almost everything else in this small plot of land, these men represent the confluence of and tension between white and black Americans in a city where slaves were sold and where scores of them crossed the river to their freedom. I notice that the white man Seth Barton, who helped establish this area on land that was once part of the slave-holding plantation of George Washington's sister Betty Lewis, has a street named after him and a noted gravesite at one of our most beautiful and historic churches. I notice that the former slave Henry Dean has neither. These photos on the historical marker show 2 things. The top one has this caption: "Small dwellings characterized this post-Civil War African American community." I notice that it has a punctuation error. I know, who cares? Me, I'm an English professor. And I think about the few opportunities we have to record history in stable ways, and how easy it is to let mistakes creep in, mistakes much larger than a missing hyphen. The bottom photo shows some of the houses that were owned and sold by Henry Dean and his wife Lucy. I had to find her name in an old PDF online after several searches. She's even more of a ghost than he is on this land, though I learned she was an active business partner while raising 11 children. This picture illustrates that some of the homes here are still characterized by limitations of will, of money, of health. I don't know, or know anything about the man who lives here, though I say hello when I pass and he's sitting on the porch. This picture is of houses a few doors up and basically in the same location as those managed by Henry Dean. I think the tiny house on the right is in fact one of the few Dean homes that remain here, though fully renovated. No one's preserved those homes, though I read later that they were well made, small, and efficient, and gave rare opportunities for ownership to African Americans just after the war. The house on the left went up during my time here in Fredericksburg and is constructed of cinder block. It shows the eclectic nature of the buildings in this space. I've never even figured out if it's one home with 2 identical balconies or 2 apartments. Like Dean's houses, it's unusually narrow, a city plot. I stand in one spot and photograph the 2 homes I see best. One is in need of some paint and new window blinds, but is a nice family home. It stands on a short block of Liberty Street, where every other building is a business. The other marks the start of a quick shift to very large and expensive homes on George Street. The sign out front says resident parking only. The house next door has a truck, indicating that there are hired yard workers on site. But I see not one person in my time outside. I'm sweating under my mask, and no one else is out. From my same spot, I turn backward. Now I see the very edge of Camp Park toward the back of this photo. When I look up Camp online later, I learn that before the Revolutionary War, St. George's Church owned this land as a burial ground. Later, the city of Fredericksburg used it for the same purpose. 100 years later, just after the Civil War, the graves and headstones were moved, and this became a park, named in 1881 for a local businessman, John Camp. Because there were larger headstones here, I know it was a burial ground for white people. Today, Camp hosts the farmers market, art festivals, live concerts, holiday events. This summer, it's been the site of Black Lives Matter gathering. A few more blocks toward town, I knelt protectively by one of my own kids as an armored vehicle rumbled toward us and riot police donned gas masks. Camp Park is a living space, meeting the various needs and desires of the city. The rescue squad next to it, a fountain, sometimes homeless people asleep on benches. Strangely, here on this tiny sliver of land is also a war memorial, put in the last 20 years after a major fundraising effort that was tracked by a huge painted thermometer on the site, growing redder as money came in. The cannon, much more modern than those on the local battlefield parks, makes the space uncomfortable to me. It's aggressive. It's a masculine shape that draws the eye from the gently curved memorial. Though this memorial seems especially committed to those who fought in 20th century wars, the individual who gets highlighted on the nearby marker is a Confederate soldier. Is his name familiar? A week or so ago, JMU voted to remove it from a campus building, a small example of the reckoning the nation undertakes this summer in the wake of protests for racial justice. But Maury is holding on strong here. The other slide shows Maury Field, an athletic stadium for the local high school. My children went to that high school. It's 55 or 60% African American, and its athletes compete on a field named for a Confederate soldier. I've written to City Council twice about it already. We will see. Remember the empty space in my map called Potter's Field? This field is it. A potter's field is a burial ground for those without money for an individual plot and stone. Maybe you heard the term this spring. It was used by the news to describe the massive mass graves in New York City, where those who died of COVID-19 and went unclaimed in the morgue, or those whose families couldn't afford burial, were laid to rest. I learned from my historical markers that Fredericksburg annexed this little settlement called Liberty Town in 1851, and Potter's Field was renamed the Colored Cemetery. Look at the photo on the right. It's a small memorial stone on the edge of the stadium. In 1861, 51 Confederate soldiers were buried here who died of disease in nearby encampments. This stone honors them. After the war, the town stopped doing burials here, and many of the African American graves were moved to Shiloh Cemetery in Fredericksburg. Liberty Town became a predominantly African American neighborhood, with houses like those built by Dean and businesses. As you've seen, it still sustains that mix. But by 1909, after Dean's death, the land was purchased by a local white man, Embry. I realized this family has things named after it around town, and I read later that by 1920, as Jim Crow blighted the South, the Charter for Liberty Town specified that only white people could use the property. To the left here, you see my picture of Maury Commons. Since 2007, it's been a lovely condominium building. It was built in 1919, just after World War I, as a school for white people. The high school for black people was literally on the other side of the tracks. This school closed in 1980, and afterwards it was used by the Fredericksburg Police Academy, and then as a homeless shelter. Education, segregation and race relations, police training, economic crisis, gentrification. It's like everything is all here, overlooking the old Potter's Field. Hey, look at this. On Liberty Street now, you've got what most local people think of today when they hear the word Liberty Town. In an industrial building that was once part of the Fredericksburg hardware store, we now have 40 or 50 small studios used by local artists to create and sell their work. They have classes, events, exhibitions. They provide tons of pottery bowls every year for the Empty Bowl fundraiser that benefits the local domestic violence support center. In the middle picture, you can see part of their outside yard. The flowers on the fence are being made this summer by local people, adults and children, who were looking for some creative outlet in the pandemic lockdown. Today, I'm thinking about what art can and can't do for community, for health, for tolerance, for justice. Something I do is get carried away, and I have again. I didn't walk more than 100 steps in making my artifact, but my mind went a lot further. I came home and ordered 2 books from the local library about Liberty Town, and I'll get them someday soon by masked curbside pickup. Welcome to Fredericksburg.